Hello, my name is Hannah Wiseman. I'm here with Dan Walters. I'm a professor at Penn State Law and University Park, and Dan Walters is a professor at Texas A&M University School of Law. We're here today to talk about a research project we're working on involving self-regulation or industry standards that are not traditional government regulation. And our research is entitled Self-Regulation in the Cradle, the Role of Standards in Emerging Industries. This research is supported by George Mason University through their research roundtable on industry self-regulation held in June 2022, and we're grateful for the opportunity provided by George Mason. Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Hannah. So as Hannah said, we're broadly interested in self-regulation, but as it turns out, self-regulation has a lot of different meanings. And so we wanted to spend some time just kind of explaining what we understand by self-regulation. So we're including kind of the broadest possible definition, which is self-regulation through standard setting organizations. This is broader than kind of a more traditionally narrow definition of self-regulation, which would focus on the development of standards and self-enforcement of those standards by individual firms. So that's kind of the most narrow of the definitions. Can you press the animation?
Sure.
Thank you. So our focus, though, is on SSOs, standard setting organizations, which don't usually actually police compliance with standards. They simply develop those standards, and then firms go ahead and choose which standards to comply with, and perhaps have their own internal mechanisms for complying with those regulations. But that is our broader focus. These tend to be privately run standard setting organizations, oftentimes encompassing an entire industry or a subsector of an industry, and bringing in a lot of individual participants in an industry to participate in the development of standards.
Thanks, Dan. And just one other note about SSOs is, interestingly, some of them cover multiple industries. So many that we focus on our paper are Society of Mechanical Engineers or specific industry, but we do mention others that cover a broad set of standards from cannabis to construction and manufacturing in the case of ASTM. Now, why is this research important now? Why do we think it's worth writing a paper about self-regulation? We think that despite the existing broad literature on self-regulation in all forms, whether that be SSOs or individual firms writing standards and enforcing, sort of self-enforcing, as Dan noted, we think self-regulation is particularly important in nascent, emerging industries. And particularly right now in some energy industries that are rising to the forefront of public attention as there is growing interest and concern about climate change and ways of reducing carbon emissions. So the emerging industry that we focus on in particular is hydrogen. Hydrogen is a fuel that can be produced with zero carbon energy. One can use renewable energy to break up water and produce hydrogen, and then the hydrogen is conveniently stored as a fuel that can be used in vehicles, homes, industry, and other businesses. And we focus largely on hydrogen, but we also draw examples from many other industries that somewhat recently emerged, such as hydraulic fracturing for oil and natural gas. Another area where we think private standards were quite important, those of being from the American Petroleum Institute in the context of hydraulic fracturing, but also the entire reliability of the electric grid we rely on every day for our computers and lights is regulated by a private organization, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and only since 2005 has there been public oversight. Then, of course, the internet is also a classic example of self-regulation.
So I would just add to what Hannah has said that the need for this research is kind of twofold. One is, hydrogen, perhaps more than these other industries, is an especially nascent industry, one where really there's almost no economic activity occurring right now. It's all being planned for the future. So that presents a very interesting case study of self-regulation in emerging industries, perhaps even more emerging than some of these other examples that Hannah mentioned. And then the other thing I would note about why this research is helpful, we think, is because while there has been some research about self-regulation's capacity to foster innovation, which we'll talk about on the next slide, it really has focused on particular industries and hasn't drawn sort of cross industry or cross sector observations that are more of a generalizable theory of self-regulation and its nexus with innovation. So, our research in some sense sort of plugs that hole by looking not just at hydrogen, a really interesting case study, but also across several different industries.
Thanks, Dan. I'll move us to the next slide. We have 10 minutes, so we're moving relatively quickly here through our slides. Go ahead with this one, please.
Sure. Thanks, Anna. So just a little bit more about why hydrogen is a really important thing to study right now. There's been a lot of activity just in the last few months, and we're speaking here in August of 2022. Congress just passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which created a clean hydrogen production credit. So there's a lot of legislative activity around hydrogen. There's a lot of money that has been directed towards the hydrogen industry in the Infrastructure Act that passed earlier as well. So a lot of legislative activity around hydrogen. Another reason that hydrogen is really interesting is because it presents a lot of safety issues that need to be worked through that create the need for really complex technical standards. So one thing that people are aware of, perhaps because of the Hindenburg disaster, is that hydrogen is highly ignitable, more so than gasoline or natural gas. So a lot of the concern of self-regulation, not all of it, of course, but a lot of it goes to figuring out ways to deal with this really volatile state of hydrogen. So there is going to naturally be a lot of activity around standard setting with this industry. And then the final thing that is interesting about hydrogen as well, and this is kind of a broader a piece of how we theorize about self-regulation in emerging industries. Like a lot of other emerging industries that have had to resort to self-regulation, there's a certain set of challenges that hydrogen faces, path dependence and coordination challenges. This is a heavily infrastructure based industry, or will be when it develops. You're going to need pipelines. You're going to need producers who are going to use those pipelines, and you've got to coordinate all of this kind of simultaneously. Otherwise, the industry is going to kind of sputter and not reach its full potential. So it's a highly networked industry that requires a great deal of coordination and overcoming some path dependence to find an optimal way to develop the industry. And as we'll talk about, self-regulation, we think, can play a role in navigating some of those challenges.
And let's talk more now about how self-regulation can help with those challenges, while also recognizing that it has limits. We're not suggesting here that self-regulation is a silver bullet when it comes to helping an industry get off the ground, an industry like hydrogen or others with coordinated challenges, but here are some of the potential benefits. So one is that we think that as an industry moves forward and attempts to develop standards simultaneously in the multiple facets of the industry that must emerge at all the same time for it to get off the ground, that standards in particular might offer the type of competition that is typically talked about in the governance context, with a famous paper by the economist Charles Debut talking about local governments competing for what were called foot voters, competing for people who would move to different jurisdictions because of the packages of services, goods, and taxes those jurisdictions offered. Well, standard setting organizations do this explicitly. They're competing for customers. They're competing for industry members who will trust the SSO to be their regulatory guide. With a dearth of public government regulation, these SSOs are saying, here are standards that we think will work for this industry and help you. And we think that can produce a sort of regulatory competition and in the self-regulatory sphere that could create efficient and effective standards. Also, we think that these self-regulatory standards created by SSOs create the certainty that the industry needs to make those multiple infrastructural investments, from the production to the pipelines to the distribution lines, knowing that the standards aren't going to change tomorrow. At the same time, though, the standards are flexible enough and they're updated regularly enough to allow for learning. As the industry grows and recognizes new risks or non-risks, SSOs are quite good about modifying and updating their standards on a regular basis. Jurisdictionally speaking, SSOs are also filling a major gap. It's not clear right now whether the federal government or states regulate the construction of hydrogen pipelines or import or export terminals. SSOs can provide the regulation that's simply not there. This example was also quite strong in the context of the internet, where it crossed all jurisdictional boundaries, and it was very unclear in the early stages of the internet whether or how traditional governments could regulate it. So there's the substantive certainty we talked about, the certainty for investors to know that the standards won't change overnight, that once they invest in a particular pipeline design, it's secure to some extent, but also there's some updating available. And then jurisdictionally speaking, the private governance can just produce regulation when it's simply not there or it's unclear who would regulate in the public governance sphere. And then finally, with respect to these coordination challenges, the need for multiple infrastructural development at once, we think SSOs might be particularly good at identifying all those spheres together and working in all of those spheres at the same time, whereas government agencies, we would need to draw from multiple agencies to address pipelines, production, et cetera, and that can be a time-consuming endeavor that often does not occur simultaneously. And as Dan mentioned, this gets at the issue of, for an industry to take off, there's somewhat of a chicken and egg problem. No one's going to produce hydrogen if they don't have a pipeline to send it through. No one will build a pipeline if they are worried they won't have customers. And if we have standards for all of these areas at the same time, I think that will help. Now, Dan, interject. I'm going to move quickly through these in the interest of time, but just let me know if you have anything else. In terms of evidence of these types of benefits happening in hydrogen, we think there is good evidence. We're still working on drawing helpful empirical examples, but there are quite a few global hydrogen standards emerging in the self-regulatory context. We're seeing direct competition between standards. For example, the Compressed Gas Association thought the National Fire Protection Association rules for creating space between hydrogen tanks and other infrastructure were good enough. And so Compressed Gas Association said, we're going to create our own. And we think that's an example of this could be healthy, right? We might have maybe a race to the top in terms of effective and efficient standards. And here we want to mention that government involvement can also be important in the self-regulatory context. In hydrogen, we're seeing important government involvement in terms of encouraging the formation of new standards and identifying areas where maybe we need more self-regulation. The Department of Energy is saying, we think this self-regulation is helpful, but there are some gaps. Here's where we can provide some money to support the development of new standards. We've already talked a lot about certainty and flexibility, and anyone who'd like to is welcome to contact us if they'd like to see these slides. With our 10-minute time, we don't have time to give them justice. But we already talked about this balance between certainty and flexibility, as well as the ability of private standards to fill the gaps where it's just unclear which public government, federal, state, international would regulate if it were to move forward. And then finally, with the chicken and egg problem, the need to coordinate. I mentioned that often in the public governance sphere, to address the many different parts of an industry sector, you would need multiple agencies. In the context of hydrogen, that would be Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, multiple other agencies. One SSO, on the other hand, can more easily address multiple infrastructural areas. But again, we're not suggesting that governments should be wholly absent from this sphere. Governments with a top-down bird's eye view can be quite good at identifying the gaps in self-regulatory approaches, as can organizations. So there's this interesting association of fuel cell and hydrogen energy industries that is also working to identify all the standards and see where the gaps are. So Dan, maybe you can conclude here with we're not suggesting the silver bullet, right?
Yes, we certainly are not. We think that self-regulation is a part of an answer to this challenge of promoting innovation in emerging industries. So what are the limitations of? What are the things that we should be worried about or cognizant of as we evaluate this? One is something that Hannah already alluded to, the idea that it might be necessary for government to intervene to identify self-regulatory gaps and to help coordinate disparate standard setting organizations. Again, in an ideal world, standard setting organizations have sort of a panoptic vision of the entire industry and can move quickly across jurisdictional boundaries and have all of the flexibility that Hannah was talking about. But sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes the competition isn't fully there. And it might be important for government to step in, as the Department of Energy has in the context of energy, to try to bring the relevant players into the room with each other and get a broader conversation going. So we're seeing that happen in hydrogen, but it's certainly something that needs to be baked into the design of a self-regulatory system for emerging industries. Another limitation of self-regulation is that chicken and egg problems apply to standards, not just technologies. So there can be a lack of investment in standards. And obviously we need to be aware of that and correct for that bias. And then finally, a very important point that oftentimes comes up when we talk about self-regulation is that there's always a danger with self-regulation of self-interested behavior, of anti-competitive behavior, perhaps co-opting or capture of standards by specific industry players. This might be particularly acute as a problem in highly networked industries, right? Like hydrogen. So you need to be aware that that is always a possibility, and to be able to evaluate the actual substantive merits of the self-regulatory programs that are developed to make sure that they're not being rerouted for purposes that will ultimately stifle the kind of competition that we want in an industry.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to anyone watching this. Please do contact us. You can find us on the Texas A&M and Penn State websites. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much.